What if we told you that if you're American, you've got a much higher chance of dying young next year than if you come from another highly developed nation? Something has gone wrong with health in America. A huge story in 2023, and we predict an even bigger story in 2024. Today, we'll explain as we pile on the pain. Don't worry, we'll do a follow-up show later to get all the super positive things about 2024. But right now, we'll ask you this. Did the thought ever cross your mind at some point this year that not only your life but the future of mankind is delicately balancing on a rather wobbly precipice? Did you ask yourself in 23 if we're walking into World War III toward a nuclear apocalypse? Have you ever asked if we're pushing our luck with viruses? Are we facing an economic meltdown as our jobs are swallowed up by artificial intelligence? Is a certain election going to drive a giant spike through society in one country? As we try to deal with such struggles, will our polarized beliefs lead to anger and violence at a time when censorship has hit levels that wouldn't be out of place in George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984, or even China? Yes, today we'll talk about China too. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of some of the things we just mentioned, let's talk about something more large-scale than what looms over us all. That is a global recession. Are we heading into one in 2024? An expert speaking to Fortune seems to think so, with the magazine writing, "Recession is likely in 2024." He explained that companies face a huge shock of having to refinance debt at higher interest rates. That doesn't sound good. In short, a recession is a downturn in economic activity that lasts more than 2 quarters. The U.S. definition states it is normally visible in real GDP, gross domestic product, real income, employment, industrial production, and wholesale retail sales. Recessions for most people suck. They can mean lower wages, businesses going under, work hours slashed, and increased income inequality. With that in mind, no one really wants a global recession, especially if they're heavily in debt already. This is likely a scenario for many Americans, given U.S. debt levels are breaking records right now. In the UK, the media is also talking about the ticking time bomb of household debt. Canada isn't doing amazing either, doing much worse than the UK and the US. South Korea is really bad. Hong Kong, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and Thailand are super bad. Australia and Switzerland are like ticking nuclear bombs of household debt. The Brookings Institute wrote in 2023, globally household debt levels are at historical high levels. In October, Bloomberg ran the headline, "World debt surges to record $307 trillion, rises as share of GDP." We should just add that if you adjust for inflation, debt during the 2008 economic crisis was worse for many nations. It is generally thought that when a country has too much household debt, it's bad for growth and stability. In Australia, news media sources are saying that it's causing stress on the economy, as well as leading to people working longer hours and spending less on consumer goods, which fuel the growth of a country's GDP. We'll give you more details about debt later. 7 out of 10 Americans say they expected a recession to strike by the end of 2023, but in a Bloomberg poll, 70% of respondents said one will hit not this year but in 2024. Still, The Economist wrote in 2022 why a global recession is inevitable in 2023. Experts get things wrong all the time, especially economists. We started making this show at the beginning of November, and so far we have yet to see this so-called impending recession. Even so, the Economist Intelligence Unit tells us that continued geopolitical tensions, monetary tightening, and supply chain disruptions will have a deleterious effect on the world economy in the year ahead. It cited newer polls that tell us the Bank of America predicts the U.S. has a 35 to 40% chance of being hit by a recession in the next year. 84% of CEOs said in 2024 recession is coming, as did 48% of economists in those more updated polls. People tend to have gloomy outlooks when it comes to life, but in 2023 those outlooks got gloomier. We hope this show today will explain why in all of its complex details. A decade ago, 22% of Americans in a poll said they believed the world would end during their lifetime. This data came from a global survey. Americans and Turkish people were top in terms of the number of respondents who said the end of the world is nigh. The other countries just below on the list of a wide doomsday outlook were in order: South Africa 21%, Indonesia 19%, Mexico 19%, Argentina 19%, China 16%, Poland 16%, and Japan 16%. Only 8% of Brits felt that the world would end in their lifetime, compared to 13% of Australians and 12% of Canadians. The British are often called pessimistic by nature, but according to this poll, relatively, Brits think the state of the world is hunky-dory. Well, it's been a tough decade since that survey was taken. Things have changed. 5 years after that survey, people from 17 countries were asked, all things considered, do you think the world is getting better or worse? Or neither getting better nor worse? 58% said getting worse, 20% said neither, and just 11% said the world is getting better. 65% of Americans said things are going to get worse, and just 6% of Americans said the world is improving. Right now, polls show Americans are more pessimistic than they've been for a long time. In 2023, when Pew Research conducted a survey across 24 countries, the majority of adults in 18 of those countries said their nation's economic situation was poor. 70% of adults on average in those nations said things were bad. Some of the highest rates of doom and gloom thinking regarding the economy of their own country were in Argentina, France, Italy, Japan, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, South Korea, and the United Kingdom. About 75% of people in those countries held a negative outlook where the economy was concerned. Some of the other countries where the majority of people saw economic doom and gloom ahead, but to a lesser extent, were Australia, Brazil, Canada, Greece, Hungary, Poland, Spain, Sweden, and the United States. In fact, the only countries that had a majority of people saying the economic outlook was good in their countries were India, Indonesia, Mexico, and the Netherlands. Pew concluded on average, there's much more negativity regarding economic stability than there was in the recent past. The question is why? Shouldn't humanity's advancements be making people think things are getting better? Has no one listened to the likes of Steven Pinker, a well-known academic who says the world is so much better these days than it was in the past? Are things this bad, or do they just feel this bad? If we look at how Americans feel right now, 66% believe that by 2050 their economy will be weaker. 71% say the U.S. will be less important as a country regarding its position in the world. 77% say the U.S. will be more politically divided, something we'll soon discuss, and a massive 81% said that gap between the rich and the poor will be even greater than it is now. 63% said they are pessimistic about the country's moral and ethical standards, and 59% said they are pessimistic about the education system. 6 in 10 said life in the U.S. was better for people 50 years ago than it is today. Pew said their outlook for the future has worsened. According to Pew, 80% of Americans are dissatisfied with the way things are going in general. 46% say they expect those conditions to worsen in 2024, while 36% said things will be about the same, and 17% said the economy will improve. Compare that to 2 years ago, when 44% of Americans said the economic conditions would improve. Of course, this is not the people of the entire world, but as we just showed you, a lot of people over the globe have similar fears right now. The World Economic Forum said in 2023 that the rising cost of living all over the globe is the biggest threat people face. It said the countries hit the hardest by the rise in food prices are Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Lebanon, Argentina, and Turkey. In Zimbabwe, reports say families are spending 10 times more on the same things they were 16 months ago. Business Insider Africa wrote in 2023, petrol prices have surged by over 900%, while food prices up 750%, fertilizer costs up 700%, and period pads up 600% have also significantly increased. Things in the Western developed world are better, but for most countries, rich or poor, these are tough times. 72% of Americans said they were currently worried about the price of food and consumer goods, and 61% said the cost of housing is a concern. Still, matters seem worse in the UK. In 2023, The Guardian wrote, the average US household is almost a third richer than its UK counterpart, and most of this difference is down to housing being cheaper in the US. Nonetheless, the report added, US households have squandered much of the gains from higher average wages on the soaring costs of a health insurance system that delivers a worse mortality rate than the UK. Mortality. Now that's a scary word in the US these days. The cost of living crisis in some countries is making life hard, which might explain some of the negative statistics we're seeing. The UK has seen hikes in rental costs, with one report saying 3/5 of private renters cannot afford the cost of living. It's been crisis after crisis for many people around the world, starting with the COVID-19 pandemic and then the war in Ukraine, which affected the availability of Russian oil and gas. That then, according to the World Economic Forum in 2023, has made people vulnerable to energy poverty. The Guardian in 2023 talked about a frightening collapse in the lives of the British poor, where an explosion of extreme poverty has occurred and rates of destitution have more than doubled in the last 5 years. This was based on what the media in October called a flagship study. 3.6 million Brits, according to the latest data, now live in destitution, unable to eat enough or buy simple necessities such as toiletries. A major food bank distributor said in 2023 that it delivered over 3 million parcels, up 37% from the year before, with 750,000 people asking for food parcels for the first time ever. In 2017, the same charity only distributed about 1.2 million parcels. 2024, say the pundits, is going to be much of the same for struggling people in the UK. Reports state that in the UK, the population is collectively £1,846.5 billion in debt, over $2 trillion. This is an increase of $35.1 billion from the $1,811.4 billion at the end of August 2022. It works out at an extra £660 for every UK adult over the entire year. The average total debt for every British household, including mortgages, is £65,756 or about $79,000. And the average personal debt is £33,410 or about $40,000. These levels are not so awful, but they are when the cost of living becomes an increasing burden. And there's a global recession. The same goes for many countries, not just the UK. As we said, Australia is household debt central. 2023 was a bumper year for debt in the US, with the total credit card debt in the country going over $1 trillion for the first time ever. Household debt hit a record $17.06 trillion. For every household, that's an average of $101,915. Personal debt was stable compared to the previous years at $21,800 on average. Still, if there is a recession, more war, and less work, it might be hard to pay these debts. Indeed, the week we started making the show, US media announced Americans are struggling to pay their debts as economy tightens. Other mainstream media outlets said with over half of Americans living paycheck to paycheck, many can't pay their debts. Fortune said Americans are drowning in debt. Is this why there's widespread pessimism in the US, or is it about more than that? The cost of living crisis doesn't seem to be getting any better and certainly won't be gone in 2024, not in the UK, in the US, or not in other nations. The IMF explained, a combination of climate shocks and the pandemic disrupted food and energy production and distribution, driving up costs for people around the world. Russia's invasion of Ukraine worsened an already difficult situation by pushing the prices of energy, food, and fertilizers even higher and exacerbating energy and food shortages. Some of the experts we read said things will get worse before they get better. The Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales wrote, cost of living crisis to last until end of 2024. The Guardian wrote about numerous nations in this struggle to survive, all the way from New Zealand to Nigeria. The global toll of the cost of living crisis, the article said, is pushing millions into poverty. If you're watching the show and you haven't felt the sting of the cost of living crisis, count yourself fortunate and see how you feel by the end of next year. But what does such hardship do to our health? The NHS wrote about the stress poverty causes and how that's affecting health, stating, there's a risk of devastating and long-lasting impacts on people's health and well-being, which are linked with obesity, eating disorders, malnutrition, and depression. The Guardian in 2023 said, child mortality from trauma and sudden death rising in England. It cited a study that said there's a strong correlation with poverty. Since the pandemic, there have also been numerous articles talking about the increase in so-called deaths of despair, deaths related to hardships such as overdoses, self-harm, and alcohol-related liver disease. The U.S. is a world leader in this regard. In 2023, the Wall Street Journal wrote, young Americans are dying at alarming rates, reversing years of progress. While the journal partly blamed things such as car accidents, homicides, and drug overdoses, insurance companies said in 2023 that there had been an alarming rate of natural deaths. USA Today wrote in 2023, among working people 35 to 44 years old, a stunning 34% more died than expected in the last quarter of 2022, with above-average rates of other working age groups too. The U.S. Center for Disease Control showed that younger adult mortality rates were up. There was an increase in cardiac mortality in all ages, plus increases in the number of people dying from stroke, diabetes, kidney, and liver diseases. This data compelled the Financial Times in 2023 to write a story titled, Why Are Americans Dying So Young? With the subheading, U.S. life expectancy is in free fall as the young and the poor bear the brunt of struggles for shared prosperity. The New York Times also asked in 2023, why are so many Americans dying? Researchers at Oxford University who publish on the website Our World in Data said using the Human Mortality Database, they've seen a worrying increase in excess deaths in 2023. If you look at the data, there's been a worrying trend in the uptick of excess deaths in a lot of countries, with many showing increases of 10 to 20% or more compared to pre-pandemic levels. While the monthly data fluctuates, there's nothing to suggest that in 2024 these frightening numbers will just disappear. The BBC wrote in 23, excess deaths in 2022 among worst in 50 years. And while things got a little better in 2023, they were still high throughout the year. That's why The Guardian wrote in 2023, Britain's excess death rate is at a disastrous high. Even so, it's still not as bad as the US. The Royal Society of Medicine in 2023 wrote, a new analysis of global rankings of life expectancy over 7 decades shows the UK has done worse than all G7 countries except the USA. The Harvard School of Public Health wrote in 2023, US life expectancy has declined to 76.4 years, the shortest it's been in nearly 2 decades. In another New York Times article, it explained, at every age below 80, Americans are dying more than people in their peer nations. Infant mortality is up to 3 times as high as it is in comparison countries. 1 in 25 kindergartners can't expect to see 40, a rate nearly 4 times as high as other countries. And Americans between 15 and 24 are twice as likely to die as those in France, Germany, Japan, and other wealthy nations. 2 U.S. doctors writing for Mercury News in 2023 said the same thing, stating, excess deaths in the U.S. are rising at a shocking rate. They explained this pattern is not limited to the U.S. Excess pandemic deaths are elevated by 5% to 20% in Great Britain, most of Europe, and Australia. Deaths of despair don't cover it, they said, adding, the reason for these excess deaths defies simple explanation. The cause is certainly multifactorial. The article explained many of the victims of early death have been teenagers, young adults, and those in early middle age. It said that the average health-adjusted life expectancy, lived years without disability, for someone in the U.S. is now the same as the average for a person in the impoverished seaside town of Blackpool in England. This once bustling tourist hotspot, home to the Pleasure Beach and happy kids sucking on rock candy, has reportedly turned into a center of joblessness and addiction, and it has the worst life expectancy in all of Britain. Comparing life expectancy there to the average American life expectancy, as the Financial Times did, should cause some alarm bells to ring in the US. In short, if you're a young American, you have more chance of dying than people did in the recent past. You can't get much worse news than that. US life expectancy started going down in 2019, and it looks like it'll keep going down in 2024, especially where young people are concerned. A doctor told NPR in 2023, "This is the first time in my career that I've ever seen an increase in pediatric mortality. It's always been declining in the US for as long as I can remember. Now it's increasing at a magnitude that has not occurred in at least half a century." NPR asked, how could this happen in a country that prides itself on scientific excellence and innovation and spends an incredible amount of money on healthcare? There are many reasons. The authors of one study said the lack of nutritious food, social isolation, lack of universal healthcare, higher child poverty, racial segregation, injuries, and violence all play a part, as do deaths of despair. There's likely more to it too, which the US will need to understand in order to fix it. Even with all this excess death, it seems people have other things on their minds. A large survey of Americans in 2023 said 7 in 10 adults consider cyber attacks from other countries as a major threat to their country's stability. 71% said the spread of misinformation online is another major threat. We'll talk about that in detail soon. Only 63% said the state of the global economy is a major threat. 67% and 64% respectively said China and Russia's influence around the world rings the major threat alarm bell in their head. Notably, in 2021, less than 50% of Americans said China or Russia posed a major threat to them. With Russia, there's the Ukraine problem, and with China, it's a fight for global power and influence. In world history, such battles in the balance of power arena have led to wars. Right now, it's being limited to a trade war, but many are asking, will it turn into a military war? We don't think so, not in the next couple of years anyway. But according to the 4-star General Mike Minahan in 2023, it will. He said, "My gut tells me we will fight in 2025. 2024 will, at the very least, see China vying for power, hoping for what's called a multipolar world, not unipolar, meaning only one superpower, the US. In 2023, Chinese leader Xi Jinping said outright he wants a multipolar world. The US will do everything in its power to prevent that from happening, which could at some point get very ugly, but not, we believe, in 2024. 57% of Americans said the spread of infectious diseases now is a matter of deep concern for them, which is not surprising given over 6.8 million people died during the pandemic. There was also a $12.5 trillion loss to the global economy, according to the IMF. and 1.6 billion students had their education disrupted. One of the major reasons for the excess deaths, according to the experts, was the fallout from not only the pandemic but also the lockdowns. It's no wonder people are afraid. The good/okay news is current models tell us the chance of another pandemic happening in our lifetime is only 37%. The bad news is that if we experience another pandemic, it could be worse than the last one, at least according to scientists. It's even scarier to think that the last virus might have escaped from a lab. The jury is still out on that, but people are rightfully concerned, especially when they read headlines like this from the New York Times. You should be afraid of the next lab leak. The article talked about one lab in the US explaining the pathogen studied in a level 3 lab, like Mycobacterium tuberculosis or SARS-CoV-1, the predecessor to the novel coronavirus responsible for COVID-19, are slightly less lethal but still dangerous. The risks of this level of lab remain significant, but the safety level is a notch lower. King's College in London says there are 59 maximum containment labs, aka Biosafety Level 4, BSL-4 labs in the world, where researchers work on the most deadly pathogens that exist. This work is for our benefit, but not when the pathogens escape. This brings us to the matter of misinformation, a great American fear in 2023, and we predict a bigger fear in 2024. Well, the world fears it. A global survey consisting of 154,194 respondents in 142 countries found the majority of regular internet users globally, 58.5%, worry about misinformation. Still, people naturally fear censorship too. A recent study in the US said 40% of people in the survey chose to self-censor, sometimes out of fear of the authorities, but mostly as a social filter so as to not look bad or upset anyone out of fear of being bullied. Researchers call this social media's spiral of silence. The Civil Liberties Union for Europe said this self-censorship can be harmful to democracy. We predict it will worsen, as will the fight regarding who gets to say what is true and not true regarding very complex matters. During the height of the pandemic, you could have gotten into trouble for saying the virus might have originated in a lab. You might have been mocked, demonetized, or had posts deleted. But in 2023, the bipartisan United States House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic wrote, "Mounting evidence continues to show that COVID-19 may have originated from a lab in Wuhan, China." It added the mainstream media downplayed or even denied the scientific theory that COVID-19 emerged from the WIV. In 2024, expect more mistakes like this. In fact, expect many more. People rightly fear the spread of misinformation online, which could lead to fear, hate, violence, or even extremism. This is going to be one of the biggest stories of 2024. What do we do about misinformation? It could, after all, potentially lead to conflicts, not to mention division, distrust, and ill will festering in the world. Now with the rise of generative AI, it's possible to more easily disseminate doctored photos of things that didn't happen, or to spread deepfake videos or audio of people saying things they never said. In 2024, this will become a plague on the internet. There will be bots out there that spread like locusts through our digital prairies. The New York Times said in 2023, researchers predict that generative technology could make disinformation cheaper and easier to produce for an even larger number of conspiracy theorists and spreaders of disinformation. This is one of the major issues of our time. Still, privacy advocates are saying censorship might get oppressive in the coming years. They say it's also not always going to be easy to know the exact truth where complex matters are concerned. They don't want governments to have too much control over the internet. This will be a topic of widespread division in 2024, more so than any years prior, because technology in 2023 took such a giant leap forward. The promulgation of untruths, hate, or abuse could cause serious harm to society, which is ostensibly one reason why the UK has introduced the Online Safety Act. The country wants to tame what it calls the Wild West of the internet. This year, US politicians in vast numbers have also rallied against what they call an out-of-control internet that needs to be reined in. In the EU, the Digital Services Act demands that big tech companies crack down on certain kinds of speech or face massive fines. All this was cemented in 2023, but it'll be in 2024 when we see what it really means. While most people don't want harmful speech and lies to circulate online, privacy advocates have called the new laws Orwellian. The UN privacy chief calls the UK's law worse than Orwell. Many academics are also saying this, explaining that with the internet so tightly controlled from now on, it might not be a place of inquisitive free speech, but a tool of political propaganda for controllers. They're also skeptical of how governments might define content that is, quote, harmful. The LA Times wrote, "There are strong reasons to believe that the law is a cure worse than disease, likely to result in serious collateral damage to free expression." The US is one of the countries where most people are worried about censorship, given the cherished First Amendment, but in 2024 the US might catch up to Europe, is what some pundits are saying. Artificial intelligence may play the role of villain in one of the elections scheduled in 2024. The threat is real, say the experts. In 2024, there will be elections in the EU, the US, the UK, possibly, Russia, India, and Taiwan. 40 countries in total will have general elections in 2024. Disinformation campaigns could go through the roof, so some kind of control will be needed lest societies all over the world get covered in an avalanche of lies, deceit, and half-truths that could affect the outcome of those elections. Trust us, this is going to be one of the biggest stories of 2024, how AI broke the internet, and did governments overreach in their effort to fix it. We're living in a time of profound technological changes, and the struggle to control the internet next year is going to cause everyone a lot of headaches in 2024. Expect to have a lot of your harmless posts taken down in the next year by an algorithm not smart enough to understand that content was indeed harmless. People will be locked out of their accounts, much more than they are now, even when they haven't broken the rules. Tech companies won't risk the criticism or the fines, so they'll clamp down hard. Many people fear that AI will automate a lot of human jobs next year. And it certainly will, especially where customer service, law, accounting, insurance research, sales, writing, and graphic art are concerned, just to name a few. Researchers from OpenAI, Open Research, and the University of Pennsylvania said in 2023 that new AI will affect 80% of the workforce in some way, but not necessarily replace humans. They said almost 20% of workers in the US will see at least 50% of their tasks impacted by generative AI. But they added that around 15% of all work tasks will go to AI. In 2024, expect some amount of AI disruption in your work life, not always for the better. Goldman Sachs believes the first wave of generative AI that we're now seeing will replace 300 million jobs around the world in the coming years. A report from Forrester said 16% of jobs in the US will be replaced by AI before 2025. However, many experts have said AI will lead to prosperity. We'll save that for our positive 2024 show. As for the war in Ukraine, one of the factors behind this cost of living crisis around the world, it's likely not going to end in 2024. When we started making the show, talk about nuclear weapons was being played down by Vladimir Putin, but he did announce a successful test of a new strategic missile. His language showed he was quite content with going on with the war. Russia's budget for 2024 also shows it's preparing for a long war, with the country set to spend a record 6% of its GDP on defense. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace wrote, "The Kremlin isn't just gearing up for a prolonged war in Ukraine, but apparently sees certain economic benefits from such a scenario." Pundits right now say Western governments could be supporting Ukraine well into 2025. We can expect more economic hardships as the profound effects of the war ripple out, just as more Ukrainians lose their lives and livelihoods. President Biden said late in 2023, the U.S. will support Ukraine for as long as it takes, which might be good news for the global arms industry, but not great news for the average person. 6 in 10 Americans still want to keep giving aid and military support, but surveys show support has waned this year. In October, Reuters said some 52% of Democrats backed arming Ukraine in the most recent poll, down from 61% in May. Among Republicans, support for sending weapons to Kyiv fell to 35% from 39% in May. An expert told CNBC in October that the war could go on for several years. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg said in September to prepare for a long war. In 2024, we believe many Americans and many people from other countries will be clamoring at their governments to help put an end to the war. We predict it won't happen in 2024, though. Then there's the Israel-Hamas war, which the United States Institute of Peace said could spin out into a nightmarish scenario of a world war. This doesn't look likely now, but as we make the show, the very ugly conflict shows no signs of de-escalating. How you think about any of these issues if you're in the US might depend on which political party you subscribe to. Americans are more polarized than ever, is what the media is saying, which especially doesn't bode well for 2024. The Atlantic called this dividing line in the US the doom spiral of pernicious polarization. saying that no wealthy democracy in the entire world is as polarized as the USA right now. According to a study conducted by the Public Religion Research Institute in partnership with the Brookings Institution, an overwhelming majority of people in the U.S. think democracy is at risk with the 2024 election. 1/4 of those people think they may have to resort to violence to save the country. We're in for a rough ride in 2024, especially if people are suffering economically, as that always creates stress in a population. Will the election take that stress to its breaking point? We hope not. Many Americans, regardless of where they stand politically, don't see an easy way out of trouble. After conducting a poll of American beliefs in 2023, NBC said it has never seen such pessimism in the 17 years it's been holding the poll. It published the headline, "71% of Americans believe country is on wrong track." Still, in a Pew poll, Americans did agree on some things, which shows they can be on the same page at least sometimes. Pew said 94% of Americans agreed that we should teach our children both the good and bad aspects of our history so that they can learn from the past. Only 4% said we should not teach children history that could make them feel uncomfortable or guilty about what their ancestors did in the past. Why can't people seem to agree on anything or just discuss issues without becoming upset? Why does everything seem so black and white? There might be a reason. Studies have shown how social media can create mob-like environments where a person can easily gain approval by showing antagonism toward another group, which gives people a sense of belonging while helping them out with some extra dopamine. They often act differently from how they would act in real life, as the average American in 2023 spends 6 hours and 58 minutes online per day. Much of his or her communicative life does not involve face-to-face interactions. Researchers have talked about how tech platforms can, through the process of antagonism and reward, drive polarization, which is one reason why there's so much division and animosity in the world right now, they say. You become enraged, which causes rage back at you, which becomes more rage until you're both throwing balls of digital fire at each other. Countless studies talk about how these emotional responses online are detrimental to health and mental well-being, not to mention the feeling of isolation. Many recent studies say teens now spend much time physically interacting with their peers, meaning they're more likely to be part of what's called an online echo chamber. This happens to adults too, of course. A paper in the National Institutes of Health said partisan animosity toward the other is getting worse, not just in the US, but around the world. It stated India, Poland, Colombia, Bangladesh, Israel, Indonesia, Britain, and Brazil are just some of the many countries facing growing levels of political polarization, and some research attributes this intergroup conflict to the rise of social media. Other critics on the matter also say that the divide isn't helped by partisan media outlets that cater to partisan audiences as they try to make money after tech cut into their advertising revenue. The paper warned of politically contentious topics gaining traction on social media, which can amplify disagreements. Some writers have discussed our present polarization as a divide-and-conquer method, so society can easily be ruled by its oligarchs. But these researchers said to be careful about troll and conquer, in which bad actors create instability by filling social media with divisive language. Russia has tried this already in the past, but we can expect things to get really bad in 2024 since all those elections are coming up. With the rise of AI bots in 2024, the seeds of discontent might be more easily planted online by those bad actors. There's no easy way out of this state of polarization we seem to be in, but given the problems we face, especially the ones we discussed today, let's hope we find a way to talk about national and global issues from many points of view with open-mindedness, civility, and curiosity. Our personal well-being might depend on it, and our societies might benefit. Nonetheless, it might take a negative event to bring people together. Many climate scientists are saying that temperatures in 2024 might jump to a level never seen before, even though the World Meteorological Organization said in 2023 that the last 8 years have been the hottest on record. Seems it might get even hotter than expected. The BBC said in 2023, experts say 2024 will be the world's hottest year on record. They fear it'll help push the world past a 1.5 Celsius warming milestone. With that in mind, we might need each other more than ever, as the heat and its consequences play havoc with our crops, our towns and cities, our health, and our sanity. Be safe, people. Have a good 2024. Now you need to lighten up your day with craziest things found on Google Maps, or see how things aren't really that bad with why the Dark Ages were the worst time to be alive.